we're actually sharing with them things that most people don't know about the policy behind global warming and what it means to you personally, right here in Oregon. And you have to understand is that there's a federal bill out there. That's the correct one. Americans for Prosperity Oregon launches our Stop the Panic tour. And you can see there's a picture of me speaking. We give a PowerPoint presentation, which I'll go through very quickly here in a moment. If you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see a picture of us standing in front of our motorhome where we drove around the state in this big motorhome with a rather large carbon footprint. You see our logo is the earth on fire there. Stop the panic, because there's a panicked rush to bad public policy that takes our freedom from us and takes an enormous amount of money from us. So why don't we get right into the PowerPoint presentation. I'll go through it very quickly there as soon as you guys can bring it up there.
Okay.
Stop the Panic tour, because panic is never good policy. In your personal life, it's not good to panic. Let's go to the next slide. It's never good to panic in your personal life, and it certainly is not good to panic when it comes to public policy. Well, we believe at Americans for Prosperity, yes, the earth has been warming. We don't believe that's primarily because of man, primarily. Okay, we believe it is, well, and we have some footnoted notes there on the screen. New data shows that actually the earth has been cooling in the last few years. Depending on whose data you believe, we tend to believe University of Huntsville and others who study this with what we think are more accurate measurements. We know that we've identified a solar flare cycle on the sun. We think that impacts it. We know that NASA satellites have picked up warming and melting of ice caps in places like Mars. And I don't think there's a lot of CO2 being released by astronauts driving around space in
the
their
whole
SUV.
solar system is warming along with the Earth.
Precisely. Next slide, please. So these folks, Al Gore there in his movie, in the Kyoto Treaty, IPCC, and Senator Joe Lieberman, who's a very nice man. Unfortunately, he's very deceived on this issue in Kyoto, which is failing in Europe, as you know. In there, it is not reducing CO2 levels. In fact, they're increasing at a huge economic cost there. They frankly don't care about the science. Move on to the next slide, please. Why? Because they want to panic us. Because when they panic us, we're willing to accept an idea when you're panicked. And a great example of that is this incredible socialist bailout of so many privatized industries in America we've seen over the last month here. All because Congress panicked. Well, the same thing is happening here. Let's move to the next slide. So why would they want to panic us? Very simple. They want our money and they want our political power, because they know that when we're panicked, we'll accept socialist ideas of control over our lives, which is why we have that little graphic there of the socialist with the gun to the head of the capitalist. Now, throw up, if you would, put on the screen that other page from the Telegraph regarding what's behind some of these ideas of socialism in terms of government control. From the Telegraph UK, there's an article here about the former chairman of an international bar council is calling for an international court for the environment to punish states that fail to protect wildlife and to prevent climate change. So what this man and a group of people on an international level are advocating is that we could be prosecuted at the state level here in Oregon, or perhaps individually, if we don't take steps to curb climate change. Let's go back to our PowerPoint presentation quickly, and I'll very quickly finish that up so we can talk a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. If you go to the net, you'll scroll through them there quickly, and you'll see that we'll, if you think we're kidding about this, no. The gentleman on the far left there is Maurice Strong. He's a Canadian multi-billionaire. He was, as your readers can see, he said, isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations would collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? He said that back in 1992. This is a man who's made a fortune in capitalism, but is willing to implement socialist ideas, including the absurd proposition that industrialized civilizations would collapse and that we should engineer their collapse economically.
Now, he sounds like somebody who would be part of the New World Order.
Absolutely. In fact, he is a partner with Al Gore, whom you can see there, in a green investment firm that trades carbon trading credits, which is something and they're making hundreds of millions of dollars from it. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry now based on the Kyoto Treaty. Let's move to the next slide, please. And now, enter Senator Lieberman and Senator John Warner, Republican from Virginia. They put in the Climate Security Act, introduced this bill. What you see on the screen there is an analysis of the elements of their bill by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The little red hexagons are regulations, are mandates. The blue hexagons are regulations. This is, in the center is a flow chart, some timelines there. That is an enormously complicated, and I speak from having served in the legislature and implementing bills and regulatory processes and how you implement legislation and rules and all of that. It's extraordinarily convoluted. This is, it's almost incomprehensible to realize how that might be implemented. Well, Senator Barbara Boxer got actually introduced some amendments to it, and if you go to the next slide, it has become even more onerous, and that's what the next slide shows you. It's even more stunning to see the incredibly increased levels of mandates and regulations that states and we as individuals and business people will have to comply with. Now, in this also, there's a lot of new taxes. If you go to the next slide, please. Actually, skip that one. Let's go to the next slide. It's almost $7 trillion in taxes, $1 trillion in taxes in the first 10 years. And you can see how the money gets divided up. Some of it goes out of America to foreign nations to help them with deforestation, adaptation. And there's $500 billion there to help wildlife adapt to this concept called cap and trade. Now, it's amazing that wildlife have been adapting to the changing climate for a long time. Why we would have to give $500 billion, $500 billion for wildlife adaptation, it's nothing more than a political payoff. In fact, if you look at each of them, they pay off local governments, state governments, they pay off cities, they pay off counties, local utilities, and they pay off businesses. The only way we can stop this from happening and its negative effects on us is if we band together at the grassroots level and say no. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is the effect of this bill, the federal bill, National Association of Manufacturers. This is the effect on Oregon by 2020. And by the way, there are much more severe numbers, and we'll get into that by other people. But in what is 11 short years now, the range of loss could be up as high as 21,000 jobs by then, and by 2030 you can see it go as high as perhaps 40,000. Next slide, please. What is the effect on our loss of dollars? What is it going to cost each of us out of our households here? You can see the ranges there, perhaps as high as by 2020 of $3,000 a year out of our pockets to comply with this legislation that probably will not make any difference overall in worldwide amounts of CO2. And as high as perhaps 7,000. Next slide. And then the effect on Oregon's total GDP, the total amount of business that we do here, it's several billion dollars, as you can see, of the loss there. Again, these are National Association of Manufacturers. There's some analysis by other people that is far worse than this. This is a more moderate estimate of what the federal legislation can do. Next slide, please. Now, there's something else that's even worse than that. And this gets to the EPA, because of a Supreme Court ruling, is now considering reclassifying CO2, which I and you are breathing out of our mouths right now. It's a building block of life. If you can't exhale CO2, if you can't create CO2, you die. It's what feeds these plants. I'm a fifth-generation Oregon farmer, and it's what makes my plants grow. They intend to reclassify it as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act because of a Supreme Court decision that said they could. U.S. Chamber of Commerce has done a quick analysis of the cost of this. It is phenomenal because now for the first time ever, 1.2 million businesses and buildings and places like churches are now going to come under these new rules if they're accepted by the EPA. In fact, go to the next couple of slides there. There's a series of industrial sector of types of businesses that will be affected. Go to the next slide. In the commercial sector, that's where you see office buildings, hospitals, schools, churches will now have to, for the first time ever, comply with CO2 emissions and regulations regarding that. In fact, it's so bad that, in fact, go to the next slide for agriculture, that if a farmer has 20 cows, these regulations will cause that farmer to have to pay $175 a year tax on those cows if you have over 20 cows on your property.
Do you believe that they will try to tax churches?
Oh, sure. Everyone will have to, not with an outright tax, because of the separation of church and state issue.
So they say, yeah.
But what they'll do is they'll put regulations in effect in terms of compliance, that you cannot exceed certain levels of CO2 emission based on the type of energy you consume and so on and so forth. This is all very real. In fact, the U.S. Farm Bureau and the Farmers Union are very angry about this issue of taxing individual farmers because cows give off CO2, they give off methane gas, okay? And so this is a very real thing. This was one of our goals of the Stop the Panic Tour, was to get the people that came to our organization, our meetings, to go ahead and write to EPA and say no. One last slide for you to see there is about Cascade Policy Institute here did an analysis of the governor's idea of this. It cost us 90,000 jobs, billions of dollars in revenue, and billions of dollars of tax revenue to local governments. And the final slide, if you go to that, is ideas that are being put forward right here. The governor's guy here in Oregon says that Angus Duncan, chairman of his Global Warming Commission, that the state ought to consider reducing the size of families, controlling the size of families and the size of house you live in. In California, right now today, they've changed their code, their building code. Any replacement thermostat or new thermostat will now allow a government bureaucrat to control the temperature of your home. This is all real. Australia and others are putting other fascinating things. And this gets back to government control and socialism. This is the real agenda behind what's going on here.